Good morning. My name is Robert Borisage. I'm the co-director of the Campaign for America's Future. And we are delighted this morning to join with William Black and his colleagues in launching Bank Whistleblowers United. And we are delighted to be part of this effort. Millions of Americans were devastated by the financial crisis and the Great Recession. They then watched the banks get bailed out, even as homeowners were left to sink. The banks ended up bigger and more concentrated than ever, while most Americans still have not recovered from the ground lost in the Great Recession. Out of that, we pushed to create the Financial Crisis Investigative Commission. We were founding members of Americans for Financial Reform, and today we are enormously proud to be part of launching Bank Whistleblowers United. This morning we'll hear from the principals of this new initiative, including the courageous people who risked their careers to blow the whistle on what the FBI termed was an epidemic of fraud on Wall Street. As you will hear, they began by alerting their superiors. They spoke truth to power, and then they learned that the power already knew the truth and was part of the scam. So each then began a long and generally futile effort to bring what was going on to the attention of regulators and legislators, to get the Justice Department to act, and finally to warn citizens about what was going on. It's only after Wall Street blew up the economy that we discovered how extensive the illegal activity was. Senator Bernie Sanders says that the business model of Wall Street is fraud. And when you look at the list of crimes that the banks have paid fines for without admitting guilt, being required to admit guilt, it is truly staggering. So we've seen massive defrauding of homeowners on mortgages, conspiracies to evade sanctions on Iran and elsewhere, conspiracies to launder the drug money of cartels, conspiracies to fix currency markets, LIBOR market, and much more. In virtually every case, bank officials have negotiated settlements. Bank stockholders have paid fines, big and small. No bank official has paid out of his pocket or her pocket, and no major official has been indicted, prosecuted, or held accountable. And too often, as you'll hear today, the people who told the truth, who blew the whistle, have paid far greater costs in their careers and in their personal lives than those who did the crimes. So that's why Bank Whistleblowers is so important, and that's why we are proud to join it. So to describe the BW and its agenda and plans, let me first introduce Richard Bowen. As many of you know, Richard was the Citigroup executive, business chief underwriter for its consumer lending group, with 35 years in banking, who repeatedly tried to warn Citi's executive management, including the likes of Robert Rubin, about the shaky business practices and huge risks and potential losses that were being racked up in mortgage lending. His warnings were ignored, as Citibank President Chuck Prince famously said, as long as the music's playing, you've got to get up and keep dancing, and we're still dancing. And that dancing led to the most costly bailout of a single financial institution in the history of the world. Mr. Bowen then took his case to the SEC, to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, to the Congress, and to Americans on 60 Minutes and elsewhere, calling for accountability. He is now helping to lead and a founding member of Bank Whistleblowers United. He serves now as a professor of accounting at the University of Texas. He's a CPA, and I was delighted to see that in 2012 he was named the leading CPA in Dallas. He has many careers and talents. Richard Bowen.
Thank you. Robert, thank you very much. We have two of our founders that could not be here today. Gary is some litigation issues. He's a litigation attorney dealing with SEC matters, and unfortunately he was not going to be able to be here. We will be tying Gary in by Skype. Also, Michael Winston spent 6 hours at an airport last night attempting to get here. He had 3 successive flights canceled So unfortunately, I think we are having to tie Michael in by audio. Again, I think Michael is on the line. Gentlemen, I've got 35 years of banking experience. I have held senior positions primarily in risk, credit, underwriting. I know how critical underwriting is to a future of banking. I grew up in that arena. And so in early 2006, when I was named business chief underwriter and given responsibility to ensure that the $90 billion a year that we were purchasing at Citigroup from third-party mortgage originators, I was responsible to ensure that these mortgages met our policy guidelines. They are very strict policy guidelines. And the sellers of those mortgages guaranteed to us, they gave us their representations and warranties, that those mortgages met our policy guidelines. And so, as I started getting my arms around my new responsibilities, I determined that over 60% of these mortgages were not in accordance with our policy. They were, by definition, defective. And, silly me, I started issuing warnings. Now, this was compounded because Citigroup was, in turn, turning around and selling these mortgages in this largest channel that I'm discussing to investors. And when they did, they gave their guarantees, they gave their representations and warranties that these mortgages met Citi's stringent policy guidelines. So we had some huge potential losses there. Silly me, I started issuing warnings. I sent email. I put it in my weekly report. I made committee presentations. And it was as if no one heard. The year and a half that I was sending these warnings, the volumes kept increasing. The rate of defective mortgages increased from 60% to in excess of 80%. And I knew that we had very severe potential losses facing us. And I vowed that I needed to get to the board of directors. Now, my boss, the chief underwriter, was equally concerned with what I was finding. He would take my warnings, put his warnings on top of them, and send them on to an even greater distribution list. And then he had all of his responsibilities stripped away. And he felt compelled to take early retirement. And my new boss, the new chief underwriter, was not real happy about all of these mortgages and warnings that I continued to send. And I thought, I need to warn the board of directors. They need to know the severity of the issues that we're facing. And on November the 3rd of 2007, I sent a warning. I sent an email to Robert Rubin, who was becoming chairman of the board. I also sent that warning to the chief risk officer, the chief financial officer, the chief auditor of Citigroup. They all have legal responsibility to inform the board. And in the email, I told them the story of how I had started issuing warnings and issued those warnings continuously for a year and a half. And during that year and a half, the volumes kept increasing and the rate of defective mortgages had increased to an excess of 80%. And we were giving our guarantees to those investors that these mortgages met our policy guidelines, but I had identified that we were not meeting those. And there were huge losses. And I told them in the email, we have potential huge losses. This is in the evidence when I testified at the FCIC. I also called for an outside investigation. I said, come in here from the outside. Investigate what's going on here. Because everybody here already knows. Well, the bottom line was I was stripped of all my responsibilities. I was placed on administrative leave. And I was told not to come back to the bank. And this was not a fun time in my life. But I went to the SEC. I testified before the SEC. Now we're dealing with accountability here. felt accountability because management did not feel the necessity of acting on my warnings. And I was trying to piece this together. This made no sense to me because I knew the critical nature of loans being in underwriting. And yet, they were taking no efforts to curtail this very profitable business model. And as a result, this very profitable business model was obviously paying some large incentive compensation. I went to the SEC. I gave the SEC over 1,000 pages of documents in July of 2008. That is 3 months before the bank bailouts. And they got very excited. They said, Mr. Bowen, we are going to pursue this. And then we had the bank bailouts. Now, gentlemen, I will tell you, the U.S. government, by virtue of what I supplied to the SEC, knew the condition of at least Citigroup 3 months before the bailout. However, we had the bailouts. The SEC has never taken any action, and they have continuously refused to release any of the pages of the 1,000 pages of documents that I gave to them. I then testified before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, and they had sent their investigators over to the SEC, so they were actually very excited about this also. And the SEC, they wound up actually asking me to change my written testimony, and then my testimony was sealed. Most of the other witnesses that testified did not have their testimony sealed. Mine was sealed and sent to the National Archives. Gentlemen, we're talking about accountability. We're talking about the need to reinstate the rule of law in banking. We need accountability. At one time we had accountability. At one time we had a rule of law. At one time we had the processes in place such that the government would hold those accountable that needed to be held accountable. And we have not seen that here. And all of us on the Bank Whistleblowers United front, all of us are very concerned about this country and its future. You know, history tells us that the collapse of every great civilization began with the erosion of core values. And folks, we're on that slippery slope. That is ethics. Ethics and accountability. And we are very concerned about the decline of the corporate culture. So, thank you very much. I understand that Lewis Clark from the Government Accountability Project will be introducing Michael Winston at this point.